The silence in the descent capsule was suffocating, broken only by the hiss of hydraulic pressure and the ambient hum of atmospheric entry. Elena Navarro sat with her gloved hands resting on her knees, her gaze locked on the thick glass panel above her head. Through it, the swirling orange and violet clouds of Kale 7 smeared like bruises across the upper stratosphere. The planet's night was already creeping in, a twilight so long and cold it was whispered about even among hardened interstellar cadets. For her, it was the unknown, and the unknown was never to be underestimated. The others around her barely acknowledged her presence. 10 alien cadets, all graduates from elite academies on their home worlds, adjusted their climate armor and performed last-minute diagnostics on their survival modules. Her suit looked primitive in comparison. Stitched polymer layers with thermal padding, no adaptive membrane, no internal AI feedback. It had been approved by the Academy only because she insisted on bringing it from Earth, designed for analog missions without dependence on tech. To the others, it was laughable. She'd heard the whisper of the Urox twins behind her, clicking tongues and shared glances. The implication was clear. The human won't last 3 nights. A voice crackled in from command. Surface entry in 2 minutes. Atmospheric readings are consistent with training parameters. Begin oxygen stabilization and prepare for low-temp deployment. Evan's long night was a phenomenon few dared experience. Once the planet tilted beyond its equatorial axis, the sun wouldn't rise again for 500 hours, over 20 Earth days of darkness. Temperatures could fall below -200 DC. The planet was chosen for survival training not because of its wildlife, there was almost none, but because even the absence of life here could kill. The descent pod landed with a heavy grind, skimming across frostbitten rock before finally locking into place against a craggy slope. The ramp hissed down. Elena was the last to exit, gripping the rope handles as she stepped onto the hard, dry ice that lined the canyon floor. She could already feel the difference in gravity, slightly lighter than Earth, but not enough to feel comfortable. The air was thin, every breath dry and metallic. Deployment complete, said the instructor drone hovering above them. Shelters must be self-constructed, supplies are minimal, tech use permitted within passive regulation limits. Duration of trial, 5 Kalian nights. Rescue signal will activate at cycle end. Survive or fail. The aliens broke into clusters, each cadet rushing toward nearby plateaus and depressions where natural cover might help insulate heat. Elena didn't rush. She walked. Her boots cracked over the crystalline ground, sending strange echoes into the cavernous air. Above, the sky darkened into deep cobalt, stars peeking out like cold pinpricks. She headed toward a shallow cave she'd spotted during descent, one side angled to deflect the wind, the rock appearing dark enough to suggest thermal retention. Once inside, she ran her hand along the walls. Volcanic in nature, porous, could retain heat if there were heat to capture. She pulled out a small pack, no bigger than a school bag, and unrolled her survival blanket, metallic and dull. It wouldn't be much, but it would hold her body heat. As she unwrapped her tools, she looked to the ice outside. It wasn't like the ice she knew from Earth. It didn't reflect light in the same way. More crystalline, refracting faint glimmers from the sky, almost glowing with a blue core. She picked up a shard and held it near her mouth, exhaling softly. To her surprise, the ice hissed. It didn't melt. It reacted. The surface turned slightly opaque, and a fine mist trailed off it like vapor under pressure. She furrowed her brow. That wasn't sublimation. That was gas conversion. She wrapped the shard and stored it in her satchel. It was too soon to know what it meant, but she had learned long ago not to ignore details others might dismiss. Outside, the wind began to pick up. No sound, just motion. Even the breeze here felt sterile, devoid of scent or dust. She climbed a short rise and looked around. To the west, she saw the towering silhouette of Vrikon, the Ilari cadet. He was a tall reptilian creature with sloped shoulders and a low body temperature. His species hailed from ice worlds, so he had arrived confident, even arrogant. His shelter resembled a synthetic igloo, already humming with internal light. Farther out, the Urox twins, insectoid siblings with triangular torsos and fluid movements, had clustered near a series of jagged spires, using their multi-armed coordination to erect a hexagonal tent made of tensioned polymer. Elena returned to her cave. She built a stone windbreak just tall enough to divert gusts. No fire, no heat source yet, just the blanket and her own layered clothing. She opened a protein bar and chewed slowly, preserving her rations. Hours passed. The temperature fell rapidly once Kale 7's orbit dipped fully into shadow. The air gauge read 146 DEGC by the third hour of nightfall. Her suit was holding, barely. She forced herself to stay awake, logging her readings manually on a tactile pad. Ice density, wind pressure, ambient light level. Her gloved fingers moved stiffly, her breath forming small clouds inside the scarf that lined her face. Then the howling started. It wasn't from animals. It was the wind interacting with the planet's magnetic fields. Sonic vibrations that screeched across the mountains and dug into the ear canals like claws. She shoved foam into her ears and leaned back against the cave wall. That's when the power failures began. Across the canyon, she saw the glow of Recon's dome flicker, then vanish entirely. One by one, alien shelters went dark, like stars being plucked from the sky. She knew what it meant. The electromagnetic spikes, Kale 7's hidden danger, were active tonight. Every piece of synthetic tech relying on stored power or plasma shielding was now fried. She stepped outside, her breath catching in the frigid air. Across the ridge, the twins were moving in a panic, trying to reconnect severed lines. Another cadet stumbled across the ice, his suit short-circuiting, steam pouring out from his torso unit. Elena stood still, her eyes scanning the land. No one had prepared for this. They had relied on advanced systems, convinced that superiority came from complexity. She looked down at her hands, wrapped in crude thermal gloves stitched by hand before the trip. She had felt ashamed of them earlier. Now they felt like armor. She opened her satchel again, took out the shard of crystalline ice and held it in front of her face. She breathed on it again. That same hiss, that faint vapor. She cracked the edge gently against a rock and saw sparks. Her heart rate quickened. If this ice reacted to pressure and air, then maybe— not yet, she thought. Too soon to try. But the others were already starting to feel the cold that wouldn't end for weeks. And she had just found something that might burn. The darkness outside had thickened into something suffocating, not just visually but emotionally. Elena crouched in the cave entrance with a broken crystal shard in one hand and a small carbon filament in the other. Her breath plumed out in quick bursts as she stared into the brittle fireglass. She had no ignition source, no fuel in the conventional sense, and no way of knowing whether the strange ice would combust in a controllable way. But the spark she'd seen earlier, brief though it was, had been real. That reaction wasn't illusion, and on Kale 7, no anomaly could be dismissed as coincidence. From deep in the canyon, a faint light flickered again, then vanished. Another power source failing. Panic wasn't yet widespread, but it was building under the surface. Most cadets still clung to the belief that the system failure was temporary. Once the storms calmed, their suits would restart, their tools would reboot, and the safety grid would reinitialize. But Elena had seen enough systems fail in unforgiving conditions to know better. If electromagnetic spikes had cooked their power cores, there was no system to wait for. There was only survival, and whatever primitive means could make that possible. She turned back into the cave, scraping away at a patch of floor until she exposed dry, dark rock beneath the surface frost. She arranged a rough fire pit, stacking the crystalline shard she had collected and placing a layer of shredded fabric from an emergency wrap beneath them. Then she positioned the filament over the pile and connected it to her only analog spark tool, a hand-cranked generator meant for ignition in oxygen-rich environment. It was ancient tech by Galactic Academy standards. Most considered it a relic, but tonight, relics were lifelines. She began turning the crank slowly, the gears clicking in her numb fingers. Static built up in the filament. When it glowed faintly orange, she lowered it toward the ice. Nothing happened at first. The crystals hissed, a high-pitched whisper like steam against metal. But they didn't catch. She frowned, pulled the generator back, adjusted the angle, and tried again. On the third attempt, a tiny pop sounded. One of the crystal edges glowed briefly red, and then nothing. Frustrated, she increased the crank speed, pushing the generator harder than it was designed for. Sparks flew, one landing directly on a crystal that had been cracked along a pressure seam. With a loud snap, the shard erupted in a tight flash of violet light, sending a narrow burst of heat into the cave. Elena recoiled, her arm raised instinctively. The explosion hadn't been violent enough to injure, but it was proof, volatile proof, that under the right conditions the ice could ignite. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't imagining it. These crystals held some kind of chemical instability. Compressed gases inside them reacted to oxygen and temperature change. The structure of the crystals, likely composed of alien methane hydrates or pressurized hydrogen compounds, functioned like natural fuel packets, inert until fractured and exposed. She made a mental note to catalog the behavior. If she could create a stable ignition sequence, it might be possible to maintain controlled combustion. Not an open fire, no, but a heat source. One that didn't rely on electronics or plasma, one that couldn't be fried by magnetic interference. Footsteps crunched outside the cave. She froze, reaching instinctively for the rock she kept near the wall. A tall silhouette appeared at the entrance. Not human. Tall and broad-shouldered, with ridged skin and a faint reptilian gait. Vrikon stepped into view, his breath labored, his posture slouched. His survival armor hung from his body in a limp, dark mess, wires dragging along the ice. He didn't speak. He simply stared at her, then at the glow still fading on the rock surface. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice low and strained. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pointed to the shards arranged on the ground. "I think this ice burns," she said quietly. "But it's unstable. The wrong spark, and it flares like flash powder." Vrikon stepped farther in, his heavy footfalls echoing in the confined space. "My suit is dead. No heat, no signal. I saw light from here. I thought maybe your system still worked." She shook her head. "I don't have a system. Just tools that don't rely on anything you brought." He scoffed softly, but didn't argue. Instead, he sat down heavily against the far wall, wincing as the cold rock met his back. She watched him, noting the bluish tint starting to show beneath his jaw scales. Hypothermia, even for a species accustomed to low temperatures, it was setting in fast. "Help me gather more," she said. He blinked. "More? Crystals. The ones with fractures inside. They're the ones that ignite. I can't test their burn time unless I have enough to work with." He hesitated, then nodded. Together they set out into the darkness, careful to stay close to the cave's perimeter. She showed him how to identify the right kind of ice, the ones that refracted internal light with a faint halo. They collected dozens of shards, placing them gently into cloth pouches to avoid early rupture. The wind was sharper now, slicing through even-layered suits. Elena's hands stung, but she focused only on the work. Time blurred. By the time they returned, Vrikon's breathing had slowed. His movements were sluggish. She ordered him to wrap himself in the emergency blanket while she resumed her experiments. This time, she altered the arrangement, spacing the crystals farther apart, embedding them in shallow divots in the rock, and controlling the oxygen intake by enclosing the space partially with slabs of stone. She cranked the filament again. A slow ignition this time, not an explosion, but a steady hiss that grew into a narrow blue flame, like a gas burner on low. Heat radiated outward, warm enough to thaw the outer layer of frost on her gloves. She stared in awe. It was working. Vrikon, eyes barely open, looked over at her. "How did you know?" "I didn't," she replied. "I just watched. I paid attention." He nodded faintly, but whether it was in agreement or from exhaustion, she couldn't tell. The flame burned for 12 minutes before the crystals disintegrated into fine gray ash. Not long, but long enough to know it could be repeated. If she could stockpile enough of the fuel shards and build a more enclosed space, the burn could be extended. The trick would be regulating airflow and insulating the heat. She didn't have tools for that yet, but her mind was already racing ahead, forming plans, building blueprints in her imagination. A sharp knock sounded from the cave's entrance. Another figure appeared. Smaller, with spindly limbs and a chitinous neck. One of the Urox twins. He stepped in, shivering, antennae twitching. "Elena Navarro," he said, voice clicking. We saw light." She looked at Vrikon, then back to the alien. She didn't answer immediately. The cold crept into her bones again, and her hand hovered near the generator. She had lit a fire from ice. Now the question was, who would she let near it? Elena didn't speak right away. Her hand remained on the crank generator as the Urox twin stood at the cave's edge, shivering, his carapace coated in brittle frost that shimmered like broken glass. His large, compound eyes, usually opaque, now reflected the faint blue glow of the slowly dying flame beside her. He stepped forward hesitantly, rubbing his upper arms with two of his secondary limbs, while his primary pair clutched a half-shredded thermal panel. Verkan had stirred at the twin's voice. He shifted his weight with effort and sat up, the emergency blanket slipping from his shoulder. His breathing remained heavy, but his eyes were clearer now. Elena held up a hand to both of them, a quiet, firm gesture that froze the moment. "Who else knows?" she asked the Urox. The twin tilted his head slightly, antennae twitching with faint electrical pulses. "My brother saw the light. We told Kale's and possibly one more. Myrn from Taloric sector," Elena exhaled slowly. 5, then. The flame wasn't a secret anymore. She looked down at the pile of remaining crystalline shards, just enough for a second ignition. Maybe a third if she spaced them properly and layered the rocks again. But not enough for 5. The Urox hesitated. "We can help gather more. Your method works." She studied his face. Not that insectoid expressions were easy to read, but desperation had a universal body language. The way he hunched forward, the cautious backward steps when she didn't answer immediately. She could see the fine fractures forming along his outer shell from the cold. He wouldn't last the night outside. She stepped aside without a word and motioned him in. He scrambled in quickly, curling near Vrekan, his exoskeleton clicking faintly as the warmth hit his frozen joints. Elena reached for the shards again. She selected only 3 and positioned them in the improvised burn chamber. She adjusted the airflow more tightly than before and added a few extra strips of torn fabric to lengthen the burn. Then she turned the crank, slow and precise. The ignition came softer this time, a blue whisper, low and clean. The heat was modest but steady, enough to warm the space and begin thawing fingers and thoughts. The Urox closed his eyes. "This is like a dream," he muttered. "Warmth. On this world." She didn't reply. She pulled out her notepad and began scribbling again, estimating burn duration, calculating how many shards were needed for each cadet if she were to create a full schedule. There was no way to keep a permanent fire going unless she had hundreds of crystals. That meant one thing: collection missions. Dangerous ones. Verkan straightened. "I'll help gather more," the Urox twin echoed him. "Us too." "No," Elena said flatly. "You can't go out until you've recovered." "I'll go." Verkan frowned. "You'll freeze out there alone." "I've done it already," she said. "And I'm not using a suit with fried systems. Yours will kill you faster than the cold." She packed quickly, a rope, a shard bag, a crowbar to dislodge deeper crystals. As she slipped out, the cold bit through her clothing instantly. The wind had risen again, cutting like razors through the canyons. Her breath iced over her scarf in seconds, but she kept moving. She knew where to go, a glacial trench she'd spotted earlier that looked like it hadn't been disturbed. The alien cadets had mostly stuck to the shallow ridges. She would go deeper. The trench loomed ahead like the mouth of a predator, black and glinting. She slid down carefully, boots crunching against sharp ice fragments. The silence was profound here. Even the wind seemed to muffle itself. She reached the base and began working, hammering the crowbar into cracks, extracting shard after shard, examining each one for the right internal structure. Her fingers began to stiffen. She flexed them constantly, rotating the muscles under the gloves. She knew the signs. Stage 1 hypothermia. She had maybe 20 more minutes before her coordination began to fail. That would be enough. She filled 2 bags. As she turned to climb back up, a sound stopped her. A low guttural scrape from above. She froze, eyes narrowing. She looked up. A shadow moved at the top of the trench, humanoid but taller, broader. Then it dropped. Elena dove sideways just as the figure slammed into the ice where she'd been. Crystals shattered around her, and her satchel flew open, shards skidding across the frozen ground. She rolled and scrambled to her feet. It was Kale, a massive, 4-armed brute from the Vulnorid system, a species bred for combat. He moved like a tank with broken brakes, fast and unstoppable. His eyes were wide, crazed from cold and desperation. "You found something," he growled. "You have fire." Give it. She stood her ground. We share what we collect. He lunged. She didn't think. She ducked low, letting his mass carry him forward, then grabbed the crowbar and slammed it into the back of his leg joint. He howled, collapsing onto one knee. She didn't wait. She grabbed her satchel, scooped what shards she could, and ran. Up the incline, breath burning in her lungs. He chased her, but he was slower now, injured and heavy. She reached the top and slammed a loose boulder down the edge. It tumbled, crashing into him. The sound of impact and cracking ice filled the air. Then silence. She didn't look back. By the time she stumbled into the cave again, she was bleeding from one elbow and could barely feel her fingers. Virkon rushed to catch her as she fell. The Uroks wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. Kale tried to take the stash, she muttered. He's desperate. The others might come too. Virkon nodded grimly. Then we need to fortify this place. They worked quickly, stacking rocks across the cave mouth, leaving only a narrow crawl entrance. Elena catalogued the shards she'd recovered. Half had survived the fall. Enough for another few burns. As the new flame rose, flickering blue against the cave walls, more shadows appeared in the night outside. Some knocked gently, others didn't. But no one entered unless Elena let them in. She had built the fire. Now she had to control who it warmed, and as the temperature outside plunged lower, the cave filled, not with smoke, not with noise, but with something unspoken. Dependence. The entrance to the cave now resembled a barricade more than a doorway. Elena had narrowed the gap to a crawl space, just wide enough for a single person to squeeze through if invited. The outer wall was reinforced with slabs of obsidian ice and rock stacked shoulder high. Each evening, before starting the next controlled burn, she checked the perimeter herself. The cold was worsening, creeping deeper under her skin no matter how many layers she wore, but she wasn't willing to let anyone else handle the inspections. She needed to know who circled their shelter, and how desperate each visitor looked. Inside, the air had grown warmer but heavier. The heat from the ice fires could no longer dissipate quickly through the stone. Frost no longer formed on their breath, and the thin layer of condensation on the walls had begun to drip. It was a fragile balance. The flames had to be spaced carefully to avoid consuming too many crystals too quickly. At any given moment, only one flame burned, each timed for a cycle just under 20 minutes. The crystals lasted longer now that she layered them with mineral dust scavenged from the trench walls. She called it powdering, and it helped stabilize the combustion rate. There were now 8 beings inside the cave. Virkon had taken on the role of gatekeeper, screening requests for entry. He asked no permission to do so, he simply started doing it, and Elena hadn't stopped him. The Uroks twins helped split shards and arranged them into storage clusters, separating the active fuel from the unstable ones. The twins worked in silence, moving like mirrored shadows at opposite sides of the chamber. The latest addition was Myrn from Talaric's sector, a pale-skinned, glass-eyed being with translucent skin that glowed faintly when the fire reflected against her veins. She had arrived on the edge of collapse, but Elena had seen her recover quickly, almost unnaturally so. Myrn now sat apart from the others, watching every move without speaking, her silence unnerving. Elena hadn't slept properly in 2 nights. Her back ached from the stone floor and her fingers felt permanently numb. But it wasn't the cold or the fatigue that kept her alert. It was the tension. Whispers began after the 3rd day, quiet arguments between Virkon and Myrn, hushed debates between the Uroks and Kale. A snake-bodied cadet who had been the last one let in. Each voice grew bolder when Elena wasn't looking. She wasn't leading them, not officially, but everyone acted as though she were, and leadership always invited challenge. That morning, as she prepared to ignite the next batch, Virkon stepped beside her. "Too many are relying on your fire," he said. "Soon someone will try to take control of it." She nodded without looking at him. "I know." He added, "You need to make it clear you're not just the fire maker. You're the one in charge." Considering. She had hoped survival would be enough to unite them. But she was beginning to see what Virkon already understood. Heat alone couldn't hold people together. Structure did. She turned to him. "If anyone tries to claim authority, I want you to stop them. Not with violence, just stop them," Virkon grunted. "And if they don't listen, then I'll handle it." The confrontation came sooner than she expected. By the 4th evening, as the winds outside howled like screaming metal and ice dust lashed the walls, Myrn rose from her corner. Her long fingers were wrapped around a shattered shard she had been sharpening. The gesture was subtle but deliberate. She moved to the center of the cave, right beside the stored fuel bag. "We need to discuss rationing," she said softly. "The current burns are inefficient." Elena looked up from her notepad. "They're measured, and the formula works." Myrn tilted her head. "Then perhaps the formula needs to change. You burn for 20 minutes. I calculate 12 would suffice." "The burn isn't just for warmth," Elena said, standing. "It regulates condensation, prevents internal freeze-back, and keeps the walls from cracking. You drop below the threshold, the cave starts leaking heat." Myrn didn't blink. "Perhaps you're protecting your position more than our safety." The silence that followed was sharp. Verkan moved, but Elena raised her hand. She stepped forward. "You think you can do better?" Myrn nodded slowly. "Then do it," Elena said. She opened the pouch, pulled out 3 shards, and stepped back. "Same conditions, same tools, burn for 12 minutes. "Show me." Myrn hesitated, then crouched. She arranged the crystals with careful precision, dusted them lightly, and inserted the filament. Elena passed her the crank tool. Myrn worked methodically, face serene. The ignition sparked cleanly. The flame hissed to life, beautiful even. A brilliant arc of blue spiraled out and stabilized. 8 minutes passed. The heat was adequate. 10. At 11 minutes, the flame began to flicker. Myrn tightened the airflow, adjusting the dust again. At 11 minutes and 20 seconds, the center shard burst. A sharp crack snapped through the chamber. A spray of ash exploded across the cave. Myrn jumped back too late. The side of her face was blackened, the glow of her skin dimming. Elena stepped forward without comment. She reached down, cleaned the remains, and reignited the next set herself. 20 minutes. Steady. Stable. Myrn sat in silence, her posture low. Elena didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Everyone had seen it, but the damage had been done. Not to Myrn's face, but to the fragile piece. That night, while Verkan stood guard at the entrance, Elena sat awake near the flame, sketching new airflow designs. She felt someone watching her. Kalira approached, slithering slowly, her long torso coiled tightly for warmth. "You're not just the firekeeper now," Kalira whispered. "You're the law." Elena didn't answer, because deep down she feared that was true, and she had no interest in ruling. But survival had a cost, and now it demanded something from her she never asked to give. Authority. The flame cracked behind her, throwing sparks into the air. No longer just a fire, it had become a throne. Elena sat motionless for hours, her gaze fixed on the final blue flame flickering atop the burnstones. The others were asleep, or pretending to be. Vrekan rested near the wall, upright but with his eyes closed, his broad frame still half-lit. The Urox twins were curled up across from him in near-identical poses, their antennae tucked and still. Even Myrn, whose pride had not yet healed along with her burned cheek, lay silently near the entrance, her eyes open but unfocused. Only Kalira moved now, her serpentine body occasionally shifting to rewrap the thermal fabric around her long limbs. She said nothing anymore. She had watched the power shift without resistance, like a creature reading the direction of the wind. Elena felt the pressure inside her chest building each hour. Not fear, not even fatigue, but a quiet, creeping certainty that the structure she had created could not hold for much longer. The stockpile was nearly gone. Only 4 burnable shards remained, hidden beneath a layer of dust near her makeshift mat. Even if she and Vrekan went out in shifts to gather more, the storms outside had intensified to the point where visibility dropped below 1 meter. The ice dunes had grown taller than most of the alien cadets, reshaped by relentless wind and static-charged particles that clung to skin like fire. She knew what came next. The question was whether she could steer them towards something better before the cave turned on itself. That decision was made for her, in the hours before Kale 7's dawn, who came not as light, not yet, but as a vibration. The cave shuddered with a deep, low-frequency pulse that moved through the stone like a warning. Verkan's eyes snapped open instantly, and the twins jerked upright, antennae fully erect. Elena stood without speaking and moved to the entrance. The quake didn't last long, but it was enough. The narrow opening she had carved and reinforced with stones had collapsed halfway, leaving only a gap the size of her forearm. Worse, the cold rushing in was sharper than before, not just air but suction. like the cave was being pulled outward by the planet itself. Myrn approached from behind her, crouched and silent. "It's begun," Myrn whispered. Elena looked at her. "What has?" "The heat shift," Myrn said, her voice hollow. "Kale 7's tectonic cycles. Every 70 hours, the magnetic pole flexes. Your fires, they attracted the shift." Elena narrowed her eyes. "You're saying the ice is responding to the fire?" Myrn nodded. "You didn't just survive the storm. You altered the balance." Elena didn't argue. She didn't have the energy or the time to debate theories. She turned back to the others and motioned them forward. "We're leaving," she said. "Now." Virkon stood immediately. The Urox twins gathered their gear without question. Only Kalira hesitated. "Where will we go?" Kalira asked. "The cold is worse than before." "To higher ground," Elena said. "The ice is collapsing here. The trench beyond the eastern ridge was shielded during descent. If the storms haven't shifted that far, we might reach it." "And if not?" Kalira pressed. Elena met her eyes. "Then we burn every last shard we have and die in the open." That was enough. No one else spoke. They packed fast. Vrokon tied the satchels into his cloak, and Elena secured the generator and shard pouches against her chest, covered by 2 layers of padding. The fire was not extinguished. She let it burn as they left, its final flame flickering in a hollowed-out, skull-shaped rock. She didn't look back. The climb was brutal. The air cut through her clothing, her joints ached, and her lips cracked until they bled. Vrikon led the group, his body plowing through snowbanks and frozen drifts. The Urox twins stayed close together, using their multiple arms to support each other when the wind gusts threatened to hurl them sideways. Twice, Myrn nearly collapsed. Elena took her arm both times and pulled her upright. Neither spoke. When they reached the ridge, the sky had begun to shift. It wasn't the sun, not yet, but something else. A silver glow, just at the edge of the world, beyond the storm line. Elena blinked through crusted eyelashes and raised a gloved hand. The horizon pulsed with faint light. Not warmth, but promise. She dropped to one knee, exhausted, her arms shaking. That's when she saw it. Above the nearest hill, a small triangular shimmer flickered. Then, split into 3 distinct shapes. A shuttle. The rescue beacon had activated. Someone screamed. She didn't know who, but it was primal and joyful and broken all at once. Virkon turned to her, his face hard but his eyes impossibly soft. "You kept us alive," he said. Elena stood again, barely, and stared at the descending lights. "No," she whispered. "The fire did." Within 40 minutes, the shuttle touched down on solid rock. A ramp hissed open. A medical drone rushed forward, scanning each of them. Names were taken, blood samples drawn. Some were escorted aboard immediately, Myrn among them, her legs no longer holding weight. A galactic officer stepped toward Elena with a datapad in his hand. "You're the human participant?" he asked. She nodded. "We analyzed your survival chamber remotely once the signal reached us. You initiated unregulated combustion from native compounds?" She didn't answer. She simply pulled a single burned shard from her pouch and handed it to him. The officer examined it. "Do you know what this is?" "No," she said. "But I know how to make it burn." He looked at her. "Would you consider joining the Applied Survival Research Division? We have nothing like this on record." She stared at him a moment, then looked back at Vrikon, who was already aboard. The Urox twins were waving her forward from inside the hatch. "Maybe later," she said. "For now I just want a hot meal." She climbed the ramp. The door closed behind her. As the shuttle lifted into the thinning cold, Kale 7's surface disappeared beneath them, swallowed by cloud and shadow. The fire in her cave died hours ago. But something far greater had ignited in its place. Not heat, not light, a memory, a blueprint. And somewhere far above, in the database of every galactic academy, a new protocol would soon be etched. When the fire fails, ask the human what burns.